and thank you for joining us in today's chat, brought to you by Gatopardo and Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. My name is Mia Armstrong. I work at Arizona State University, and I'm one of the collaborators behind Simbiosis, an innovative partnership between Cronkite and Gatopardo aimed at strengthening narrative journalism in the Americas. Simbiosis includes this series of 8 public conversations, as well as a hands-on workshop in spring 2022, and an on-site residency program for select journalists, which will be held at Gatopardo facilities in the Yucatan Peninsula in summer of next year. In today's conversation, we'll be discussing in broad strokes what responsible narrative journalism looks like. We'll be asking questions including, how do we build trust in communities that have been under or miscovered in the past? How can we respectfully cover communities that are different from our own? Today's discussion will be guided by Andres Martinez, professor of practice at the Cronkite School and columnist at Reforma. Andres will be talking with Pauline Arrillaga, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation professor of practice at the Cronkite School, where she directs the Southwest Health Reporting Initiative. In this role, she leads a team of Cronkite News students who focus on providing in-depth healthcare coverage on underserved communities across the Southwest. Pauline's students report from communities of color and also focus on matters important to the LGBTQ community, rural America, people with disabilities, and others who struggle to get the healthcare they need. Their storytelling aims to highlight not just problems, but also solutions. As both a writer and an editor, Pauline has long focused on issues affecting Latinos and Native Americans and has reported from Native American communities across the West. Prior to joining Cronkite, she served as the enterprise editor and a national writer for the Associated Press. Her work helped shape coverage, examining the effects of former President Donald Trump's immigration policies on children and families. That project was named a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in National Reporting. She also oversaw the AP's 2018 series on missing and murdered Native American women, winner of the Dory J. Maynard Award for Justice in Journalism, the Les Payne Award for coverage on communities of color, and other honors. We hope you enjoy this conversation and will continue to join us throughout our series of Simbiosis activities.
But Pauline, it's really a pleasure to be able to talk to a great colleague like you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to do this. Thank you.
So I wanted to get into it and talking a little bit about your work that you're supervising with the Southwest Health Reporting Initiative, which I think is a really good example of a journalistic project that is very consciously and purposely seeking to perhaps remedy, and maybe you don't talk about it in this way every day, but as somebody who reads some of it and looks at how this is organized, it does seem to be an effort to maybe fill gaps in the way that journalism has been exercised previously, and looking at underserved communities of color, indigenous peoples, people living kind of, outside of cities and in rural areas that perhaps don't typically have the same kind of news coverage, people with disabilities, communities that, when we talked about underserved, it's by journalism as well as by, society and government, political, health systems. So there are a lot of sort of systemic issues that might lead to us, referring to certain communities as having been left behind and having been underserved and oftentimes sort of misserved, if that's the right way to put it. So yeah, you're going in with this project and you're trying to tell their story and inform the rest of us about some of these gaps in our society. How do you build trust, though, between your team, your journalistic team that's trying to tell these stories, and the communities that you're covering that perhaps have ample reason to be a little bit mistrustful of the outsiders coming in saying, we're here to help?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say that so far, the vast majority of my students, they have never reported from a Native American community, or they have never spent that much time perhaps in a border community. So they are really on the fly learning how to do this and hopefully to do it in the right way, and in a way that I hope they carry forward in their very lengthy careers after Cronkite. I think that you're right in saying that media outlets themselves are overlooking these important stories, And they're covering these communities in ways that are very stereotypical or cliche still to this day. So I think that the first thing is we have to consciously recognize that and acknowledge that, and then try to shift the type of stories that we're telling and how we're telling them. So we've made a very conscious effort to not just write about problems, but to look for solutions. And that is a really important way to build trust. I've had the privilege over the years to report from many Native American communities and work with Native leaders and experts and advocates and residents. And I cannot tell you how many times I've been asked, why does the mainstream media like to focus on everything that's wrong in our communities instead of focusing on what's right, what's going well? And that's a really fair question. And that question is what has led to so much mistrust over the years, right? We write about economic hardships and health disparities and crime, but how often do we sort of flip the coin and consciously try to find maybe a solutions angle to those stories, or focus on some of the amazing grassroots efforts that are happening in some of these communities? So I think that the more we do that, the more we're going to build trust. And that is something that I'm trying to teach our students here at Cronkite. That's one teeny tiny little step. I would say that the other thing is, I think that when reporting stories in communities different from your own, I think you have to plan on spending some time from the outset doing what we're talking about, working to build trust. It's like it has to be built into the reporting almost. You cannot expect to just drop in and get what you need in an hour and leave. These communities, people have no obligation to speak with us as journalists, right? So I think sometimes reporters, photographers, video journalists should try to put the notebook away, put the cameras away initially, and just try talking with people a little bit. Instead of peppering them with the questions that we kind of so desperately want answered.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And there's this term, right, that people now will sometimes use in a derogatory way of parachute journalism, right? That you coming in from the outside, you want your quick thing, and then you're going to leave. And it makes me a bit uncomfortable because that as a term, because I think there is an element of that to all journalism, right? Like we can't all just cover our own community. There would be no Associated Press if that were the model. And you're talking, so there has to be sort of a middle ground, right? And you're talking about taking students to places that, not only have they not covered because, they're getting started in journalism, but they've probably never been somewhere like that, right? And I think that is, and yet, this is this idea of learning about worlds that are not our own is kind of what attracts a lot of us to journalism. I can remember my reporting career was far less storied than yours, but I did have some really amazing experiences of being, dare I say, parachuted, of having to go to small towns in Western Pennsylvania. I remember I once had to do a feature for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette where the longtime postal clerk was retiring, and this guy had worked for like 4 decades and had never taken a day off, and they wanted a feature on this amazing feat and his community, and it was such a foreign place to me. I grew up in Chihuahua, Mexico, and I had spent plenty of time in big cities in the U.S., but this was just like an idyllic Western Pennsylvania, and I was definitely doing parachute journalism and trying to do it in an empathetic way. I did a series of pieces once where I spent time in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam looking at how WTO rules discriminated against catfish farmers in that community. And I was going in, and I didn't have weeks and weeks to spend in Vietnam, but I was trying to understand where they were, the people working there who were trying to access global markets and were being locked out in very cynical, hypocritical ways. I was trying to tell their story, right? But how do you do that in a way that's empathetic and understanding, and not using the subjects as props? how, how do you talk to your students about doing that? Because I do think we can't pretend that a fair amount of journalism isn't covering worlds that are not your own.
Yeah, so all right, so there are a few things that I suggest to my students right off the bat. And with my initiative, I have a new batch of students every semester. So we start fresh, every August and every January. And one of the first things I really pose it to them as a question. And the question is, how often have you, or do you just pick up the phone to have a conversation with someone, with a source, to learn and to pick their brains, instead of you're doing it because you already have a story idea in mind, you already have a story assigned, and you've got your questions ready to go. So this is something I'm encouraging them to do. One of the first things I did actually when I got this particular job back in 2019 is I reached out to the tribal liaison at the State Department of Health. And I did this very thing. I said, I'm new in this job and I'm looking for story ideas. I have some things in mind, but could I talk with you? And I went into that conversation with some assumptions about what I thought the stories would be in Indigenous communities around the state of Arizona, and he beat down some of those assumptions. I'm grateful for that, and thankful to say. And he also ended up pointing me to about a billion other fantastic stories, and helped serve, of course, as my guide. To help connect me with the right people. So, I think just being open to talking with people about what they think the stories are, so that we're finding the deep stories, the real stories. And again, not just kind of dropping in to do a quick hit about, I need to use kind of air quote marks here, soaring rates of diabetes in Native American communities, when actually there's been a lot of progress, or doing yet another story about immigration on the border, when so many Latinos, of course, care about so much more than just immigration. So that's one thing I tell my students. I have a lot of examples about this idea of using people as props.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, I hate that word. So one of the things is we need to be very conscious of this beyond just our reporting. We need to be conscious of this in our editing and in the visuals that we're selecting, in how we collect audio, how we collect video, perhaps for broadcast stories or video stories. And a couple of examples come to mind. So you mentioned that 2018 AP project that the late and great Sharon Cohen worked on with Mary Huditz, a Native American journalist, along with photographer David Goldman. So Sharon and David spent at least a week up on the Blackfeet Nation, working with people and reporting on missing and murdered Indigenous women. When David came back and we were putting the package together and we were talking about how we should display it on the AP site, we were talking about the lead photo. And David had this gorgeous, gorgeous shot of a Native American woman in traditional dress at a ceremony that happened to be going on there when he was visiting. And I thought it was absolutely gorgeous. And I suggested it potentially as the lead photo for the story. And David talked me out of that. And again, thankfully, he talked me out of that. He felt that as the lead photo, that would be too stereotypical, sort of doing the very thing that we're talking about here. And so, instead we chose a visual that was much more appropriate for the story and much less, sort of stereotypical when people think of or produce a story about Indigenous communities. We have had quite a few conversations in the Cronkite newsroom about this very thing. One of my students, who is Native American, visited the White Mountain Apache tribe during COVID to tell a story, great story, about how this community had really been working to vaccinate the community, to fight COVID, and succeeding. And the piece the visual that was chosen to go up behind her was, again, a Native American man in Native dress at something that had nothing to do with COVID. And my student took that opportunity to really raise that with the entire newsroom, and educate people about what that felt like for her and why she felt that that was offensive. So I think it's really being aware throughout the entire reporting process of not just the stories that you're choosing, but the way in which you're writing these stories and portraying these stories and visuals as well.
Yeah, that's a really good reminder that, and I think we've all read some, stories perhaps, or seeing content that is very mindful of trying to be nuanced and not be stereotypical, and all that work and effort can be undermined by a visual that in the hasty moment is selected, and or even a headline, right? So that's a really good reminder.
Absolutely.
Or vice versa. And but going back to what you started talking about with encouraging students to make phone calls, do they want to just say, like, can I text instead, or WhatsApp instead? The whole concept of a phone call is a little bit alien to the younger generation, I find. But the point stands.
Yes, and then of course their professor says, no, really, you need to pick up the phone and call. And if we're not in a pandemic, you should go and have lunch or coffee or tea. So
yes, it's like this thing that you have in your hand all the time. You can also make phone calls on it. But kidding aside on that part of it, what I hear you saying is that you shouldn't just as a journalist engage in sort of a transactional relationship with, I'm here because, I hear that, your pipeline blew up, or, diabetes rates are soaring, give me the quote, but you have to establish a relationship, and that understanding, and especially, and it should be easier if it's a community that you're covering over time. And there's just no excuse for not having that kind of relationship, but it does take some effort, and it does, in some cases, I guess, mean getting out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about educating yourself. I mean, when we're talking about border communities, immigrant communities, refugee communities, and again, Native American communities, there is a very lengthy, complex history and backstory to any issue that we're probably writing about. And we need to have some sense for that. And if we don't have some sense for that, we need to be patient, because our sources may want to ensure that we do understand a little bit of that history. That really is the context for so much that's happening today. So we do need to take the time to be interested, research, educate ourselves. We're never going to be experts probably about a lot of these communities, but we do need to do whatever we can, I think, to try to have a better understanding.
Right. I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking about the border, which is just endlessly fascinating. You have amazing experience there. I think it's going to be of interest to, a lot of the people watching this. It's really a passion of mine, having grown up in Chihuahua and spending a lot of time in Juarez and El Paso, and now in Arizona. But how do you think some of these issues have played out on the coverage of the border in recent years? And what are the things that you try to tell students to be careful of in terms of, not letting our storytelling kind of construct certain realities that might start deviating from what's actually happening, or just distort things? What are some of the pitfalls that we should try avoiding?
Well, I sort of hinted at this earlier. I think one of the major pitfalls is I think we have to start finding other stories in our border communities outside of immigration. This is such a challenge, because without a doubt, immigration remains one of the biggest issues of our time. We've seen it recently in the news. We know what's been happening in Texas. It's never going away. Seemingly, we're not finding the solutions to this problem, or what some see as a problem. But I feel like most of the time, especially the mainstream media, is going to the border. It is for an immigration story. So that in and of itself becomes a bit of a problem in terms of how we're covering these communities, right? So again, fine, you've got the immigration assignment, or we know that we need to do that. How can we find a slightly different way of going about doing that story? It's not that I sit here today with the great answer. I think, again, that's always a big challenge. How do we continue covering some of these ongoing issues in more creative ways and in more in-depth ways? But I heard a story driving home just this week from the Texas border, and having lived there for 2.5 years, I knew what that story was I just knew what was coming. In terms of how the story would go and the voice I would hear and the sound bites I was going to hear from, the immigrant who was talked with. I don't know. I wish I had better answers. I just think that we need to be conscious that these stories are so much more textural than the way in which we're telling them. I mean, again, especially when you're talking about a 1.5-minute story, audio story or broadcast story. I mean, I knew what I was going to hear.
Yeah. Do you think sometimes it feels like, for one of my frustrations in terms of just thinking about the US-Mexico relationship writ large, and then also the border, is that we only seem to have bandwidth for one story at a time. And we can't talk about the complex. And I think this is sort of related. This is sort of what you're saying, that right now, like the one story on the agenda is immigration and don't tell me about anything else. And I feel like there have been periods where it's drug cartels and violence, or it's maquiladoras at one point and commerce, but God forbid you try and go deviate from that or combine these things. And I often wonder, is that because this is what the consumers of the news want? Is this because of like editors at a national broadcaster or the headquarters of a media organization? They know that they've heard and chatter about immigration, and so that's the story they're going to assign to edit reporters, or the story they're going to be responsive to when the reporter pitches. I don't think it's probably a lack of imagination on the part or curiosity on the part of the reporters, but you've sort of seen how this pipeline of how these stories happen at these major organizations. Like, where is the sort of failure to say, wait a minute, maybe we should say, get into other stories as well?
You trying to get me into trouble here?
Name names, please.
Yeah. Well, so I do think when we're talking about US media organizations, right? And we're talking about some of these stories. I mean, look, admittedly, you've got people managing some of these stories who've never been to these places, who really cannot relate, and who have an idea of what, again, we have our ideas of what we think the stories are. And this is where it's tough as a reporter on the ground, but as a reporter on the ground, you have to advocate for that different way of telling the story, or that different angle, or what you think the story is. So I think that's a big piece of the problem. I mean, let's face it, you just hit the nail right on the head right there. We have to do our best to kind of educate not just the reporters on the ground, but has to go on every level of the journalistic process. Everyone needs to have a better idea of how we really should be reporting on, border communities, but any communities of color, disability communities. I mean, anything that you're not familiar with, you're going to have an idea of what you think the story is, but are you right or are you not right? And how do we figure that out? So you've got to advocate for it. And again, talk to people on the ground. If you think that this is actually the story, pick up the phone and talk with some people, not some expert at Yale or Harvard or whatever it is, not someone at a think tank. Talk to someone on the ground and actually try to see what the story is. And, hey, editors, send your reporters places and let them spend a day or two just roaming around to figure out whether that great premise actually plays out or whether there's a better story to tell. We don't do that enough. I realize money is a problem, but we don't do that enough.
Roaming is important. And also, just to clarify, it's okay to talk to experts at ASU. That's allowed.
Absolutely.
We're gonna edit that in. So yes.
And there's absolutely nothing wrong with talking with experts for any story.
Only if they're at ASU. But Pauline, just listening to you, I'm getting all my brain's like firing on overtime, and I'm getting all these ideas, and I have so many more questions. So we're gonna have to go get a beer and talk about all this stuff.
Okay.
And all of you watching, come join us, because there's just so much more to continue. So, but honestly, really appreciate your time. It's flown by, but I think we need to wrap this up for now, until we have our cerveza.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's conversation. Remember that this is part of a series of 8 public chats, which you can find right here, exactly where you found this one, on Wednesday evenings through December 1st. These public conversations are part of Simbiosis, a narrative journalism training program brought to you by ASU's Cronkite School and Gatopardo. The program includes a hands-on workshop held in the spring and on-site residencies in the Yucatan Peninsula held next summer. You can stay up to date on all the activities on our website or by subscribing to our mailing list, both found at the links below. Until next time, thank you, gracias, bye, cuídense, saludos.